Let's continue with this discussion on planning and mainstreaming adaptation into fiscal policy. Adaptation Solutions is up next, so let's read off the main points again. I'm not reading all the text. This is full of text. This will be full of text because typically social science like this is descriptive, discursive, as I've said many times. The IMF reports here provide three pillars approach to natural disasters that can be extended to guide the identification of adaptation solutions, which is the second block of the national adaptation plans that we talked about. The three-pillar disaster resilience strategy developed in an IMF board paper from 2019 can be extended to cover all dimensions of climate change, including continuous changes such as sea level and temperature rise, which are called chronic changes in some literature, like in the literature that is being considered by banking systems to worry about climate risks to the banking operations, and to cover countries of all sizes and income levels, which we saw a little bit before. The extended framework retains a three-pillar structure and nests the disaster resilience strategy, DRS. The prevention pillar addresses policies to reduce all climate risks and their impact. The alleviation pillar focuses on policies to address the realization of residual climate risks. The macro-fiscal resilience pillar provides guidance to secure resilient financing sources that can meet funding and financial liquidity needs. So three pillars and then some 23 other steps to implementing reminds you of Buddhism with this, truths and pathways, and there are codified ways of achieving nirvana. So adaptation is our nirvana at this point. What is the prevention pillar about? Fiscal policy can provide a wide array of public goods and incentives to facilitate the adaptation of firms and people and reduce climate risks and their impacts. Okay, so fiscal policy is very important in this sense. So we have to have incentives in the system to facilitate the adaptation of firms and people. And we talked about in the first staff note about how government can help people and firms adapt to climate change. Information is one of the most critical things, and co-production of adaptation strategies and measures is the other thing, because as we said, adaptation directly begins to affect people, their lives and livelihoods, and unless they are involved from the beginning, they will probably resist and simply delay, and may in fact increase climate risks to themselves and their community and so on. Provision of public information. So this is the point I just made. Accurate information about risks can influence public and private sector decisions on how and where to locate and develop economic activities. So literally, if you are asking people to move because of climate risks which are in the future and uncertain, and people have, if you look at the cyclone disaster prevention and management, for example, when cyclone early warnings come, there is uncertainty in the cone of pathways, trajectories it's going to take, but governments have to make decision on evacuating people who are most likely directly in the path of the cyclone and can really pay with the ultimate price. But when you ask them to move, they worry about what they are leaving behind, whether it's a fishing boat, their hut, their lifetime savings and earnings, and assets and so on. So imagine now you are talking about something that may happen in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and you are asking people to change, move and change their lifestyles or livelihoods or other things. Then obviously there will be lots of skepticism and uncertainty in terms of following the orders. For example, risk maps on flood zones, areas at risk from coastal erosion, and landslide areas can provide valuable information to property investors. Such information could facilitate the construction of private commercial and residential properties in safer areas or with higher resilience standards. Where there is a developed insurance industry, this can help in setting terms and conditions for property cover. So early warning systems obviously are critical, and I have talked extensively about this elsewhere and have a course on subseasonal to seasonal forecasts and applications, which is all about early warnings for food, water, energy, health, transportation, and so on. The reduction of inefficient risk taking. There's a lot of text here, so let's read a little bit. Accurate pricing of risks is key to incentivize agents into allocating resources efficiently from a social point of view. Governments may consider addressing the policy or market failures that distort efficient risk pricing, which we will see in a minute. Information on risks could be made more salient, more visible and important, and be used to reduce inefficiency, for example, by lowering public contributions for high-risk areas and for construction with inadequate resilience or protective standards. And there are other details. So there are implicit and explicit subsidies, for example, that may allow people to go and live in floodplains or along coastlines that are not safe anymore with sea level rise, cyclones, and lost natural defenses like mangroves and so on, or even mountain slopes, especially poor people, slums being built on dangerous slopes where heavy monsoons could wipe them out literally, and so on. So how can government reduce the inefficiency in risk taking, which is done with a short-term view? People come to, let's say, a big city, could be in Asia and South America, Africa, wherever, for employment opportunities and for providing for their families, and they cannot afford housing, and there is a tendency to go live in the slums or start new slums, and typically they take up land that's not very popular with rich people, let's say, or developers. Then they occupy these dangerous slopes and pay the price, right? So how do you prevent these? How do you incentivize people from not taking such risks? The provision of infrastructure and new technologies. Governments can make public infrastructure more resilient and ensure that needed public service delivery can withstand adverse climate conditions. We looked at it in the first podcast series from IMF staff notes as well, in terms of protecting public assets and public services is basically resilience, right? They can play a crucial role in providing protective infrastructure, for example, coastal protection against sea level rise or water management systems to handle adverse precipitation patterns in cases supported by cost-benefit analysis in a broad sense. There are many details, but essentially every time you provide infrastructure, it shouldn't be that people build in risky areas and then you start providing amenities like roads and water services, electricity, etc., to make this a hardwired risk taking in a risky area that shouldn't have been occupied in the first place. So assuming cost benefit analysis in a risk informed framework is done, then these became very important in terms of providing infrastructure and new technologies. New technologies is a broader area in the sense as innovations happen in new technologies to adapt to climate change, which is what we are focusing on here. Could be solar energy, could be wind, could be local grids, microgrids, nanogrid technologies, refrigeration technologies, whatever they are. There may be also a need for transferring technologies to the more vulnerable societies, countries, island states, emerging economies, low-income countries, and so on. So we are not talking about this. We're talking about within a government's purview, what can governments do? When new climate conditions require a coordinated reorientation of market activities or the setup of networks, governments could consider strategic investments to overcome coordination issues and scaling issues in case of increasing returns to scale. And we have talked about this also in the context of planning for sunset industries like coal, let's say, and sunrise industries like could be solar, wind, or other things. Okay, all these are complex, but they all need to play into the fiscal policy in a mainstream way. Financial inclusion can be crucial for the private sector to develop adapted risk prevention strategies. Seems obvious. For equity and efficiency reasons, governments are recommended to pay particular attention to the most vulnerable when developing and designing prevention policies. So you can see this as a normative question in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, but also it can be part of the cost-benefit analysis in the sense, if a part of the society is not resilient and is highly vulnerable, then it becomes a problem eventually to the government's fiscal policy, not only in terms of social welfare, but labor market and, affecting the weakest link, affecting the entire society. Okay, so adaptation programs can be prioritized based on cost-benefit analysis while also ensuring that decision-making process reflects society's preference about inequality. So here we are again getting normative questions. As some vulnerable groups may be disproportionately affected by climate change, society's inequality reduction goals may warrant additional support that can take the form of prevention policies, for example, developing and distributing drought-resistant varieties of seeds to poor farmers. Okay, so there are many such examples. Like, further, poor households and small and medium enterprises face greater challenges in preventing climate risks because of financial exclusion or their lack of access to information. All these are critical. So let me leave that podcast here and maybe come back and look at the extension of IMF disaster resilience strategy for climate change adaptation, as we talked about in this prevention pillar. So then we'll move to other pillars, alleviation and so on. Okay, so this is long enough, a podcast, 12 minutes. So we'll come back and look at the extension of IMF DRS to climate change adaptation. Okay.